retreat. I'll tell you a little bit more about how the other Salvo Academies have gone later on, but welcome. We're pleased to have you here tonight. My name's Casey O'Brien Machado, and I am Territorial Social Justice Coordinator for the Eastern Territory. And it's my privilege tonight to introduce you to somebody that I have great respect for. And again, we'll go on about that later on. But welcome to Salvo Academy. Salvo Academy is a joint project between Stanmore House, Salvo Young Adults and the Social Justice Department. And we decided earlier on in the year to start this new project with the idea that we wanted to have a series of discussions and keynote presentations that would help people grow as disciples, that would help people grow in their faith and help people think more about the world around them. It aims to equip believers by providing a space, a safe space, for people to sometimes ask those hard questions about issues in the world that we don't necessarily talk about all the time. And we had a great semester last semester. We're doing it in university semesters. So last time we looked at issues such as social justice and holiness and how those two interact. The Salvationist and alcohol, we had Major David Twybe come and speak to us about that. We looked at the environment and discipleship and how those two mix. And we looked at Christianity and mental health. We had a really great semester last time, and I really feel that a lot of us grew in our faith and in our understanding of the world around us through that last period. So we're looking forward to this semester. We've had some changes in personnel, and obviously changes in the mission team means that we have to re-look at how we go ahead with Salvo Academy, but it will continue. And we have the full support of everybody involved as it continues. We also want to acknowledge that this one tonight is a little different as it's not at Stanmore House. As I mentioned, it is a joint project with Stanmore House, and we've had a great partnership there, and we look forward to continuing that partnership. So we highly encourage you, as we do every time, if you have conferences coming up, if you have meetings coming up, Stanmore House is the place to have them. Right? That's the lady you want to speak to. So this one's a little different. So next time you see Salvo Academy advertised, it will be at Stanmore House from that point onwards. But tonight, the whole world redeeming evangelism, justice, and the early Salvation Army. I'm pleased to present to you John Cleary, and I just want to give you a little bit of a blurb about John. I can't help it, I'm sorry, that's my job tonight. John's the presenter of Sunday nights on ABC local radio. He's been described as one of Australia's leading commentators on religious affairs, and he is currently a member of the ABC's Specialist Religion Unit. He's often heard as a commentator on religious issues for ABC radio and television. John is best known for his years with Radio National as presenter of the Religion Report, and prior to that, the philosophy program Meridian. He was part of the original Compass team on ABC TV and was for several years a regular on Triple J. If you haven't heard John's radio show on Sunday nights on the ABC, you're missing out. His topics are interesting, his insight is always thought-provoking, and it's sure to get your brain going late on a Sunday night. John is also well known and loved within the Salvation Army. In 1994, his book on the Salvation Army in Australia, Salvo, was awarded Australian Religious Book of the Year, although John's association with the Army extends for long before that. John regularly appears at Army events, often emceeing or as a special guest as he is tonight. We are blessed to hear him, and I for one am looking forward to learning a lot. Please welcome John as he comes to speak to us on the whole world redeeming evangelism, justice and the early Salvation Army. Thanks.
Thank you, Casey. It's good to be here with so many friends, and please feel free to heckle or do anything else you wish, but save it till sort of after much of the talking is gone. Evangelism, social justice, and the Salvation Army. Where do we start? Well, of course, we've got to start with this chap, William Booth, and the world into which William Booth grew to maturity. He was born in 1829 at the beginning of what was one of the most turbulent periods in English social and industrial history. It marked around the time of the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. He grew to maturity with the Industrial Revolution, and his life was marked by coming to terms with the consequences of the Industrial Revolution. The Salvation Army was born out of those particular social circumstances. The question is, evangelism and or social justice. I think this way of expressing it might not be theologically accurate, but I think it is still politically accurate in terms of Salvation Army culture. I think the Salvation Army has never really come to terms with the tension, the legitimate tension, between its evangelical and church work and its work as a body doing God in the world. Social justice for many, many years disappeared out of the Salvation Army's lexicon, and for many years was regarded as social service. And I want to suggest there is a profound difference between the two, one being passive, the other being active. One is doing to, the other is travelling with. You could probably elaborate on a lot of those for me. So I think tonight what I'd like to do is, rather than give you a formal lecture, is take a few anecdotal observations from a few people's lives lived in those critical years, particularly between 1880 and perhaps 1914, when the Salvation Army really established its reputation in the world. Most of them are going to be British. There'll be a couple of Anglo-Australian ones. The world is changing. The Salvation Army celebrated its 150th anniversary just last year in London, and a huge extravaganza for several days at the O2 Arena, and those of you who were privileged to be there were subject to about 6 or 7 events in the arena, either participated in, enjoyed with, or suffered through, depending on your taste. But there were some genuinely wonderful aspects to that. The world is changing, and I think the Salvation Army was attempting to reflect that in what went on at that 150th anniversary celebrations. But let's go back to that East End of London, not in Greenwich, but the grimy East End of London 150 years ago. In those days, the church was the centre of the world. The local church gave people coherence and allowed their communities to exist. London was defined by its parishes. That worked very well until the period we are talking about. The Industrial Revolution smashed all of that. It smashed the parish structures. It brought people together in masses of hundreds of thousands of people crammed into local areas. The Salvation Army arrived on the scene as a response to the collapse in religion in the big urban areas. The Salvation Army was an attempt to say, hang on, the old model doesn't work. The old parish model has failed. What do we do? We're now in an era where similar changes are going on. A new wave of technology is upon us. You're seeing major industries falling prey. The churches, subject to the scandals of sex abuse, are not finding it easy to make their way in this world. But even the industry I work in, television, when it was introduced with all its optimism in the 1950s, here's an ad from the 1950s, how do you like this? How television benefits your children. And this is how educational it will be. Buy a TV and your kids can be educated at home. Yeah, spin, wasn't it? But it has taken over our lives. And a lot of people say you can mark from Australia in 1956 or wherever television was introduced to the beginning of what we call atomisation and consumerisation of our culture. Because in one instance, from the church and the school and the parents being the primary educational source for the children, it changed. It changed. The world changed. And we're still living it with its consequences, and those consequences are accelerating. At the moment, you're seeing the media landscape collapse. Here is one of the heroes of scientific broadcasting, Carl Sagan, who did a famous 1980 series called Cosmos. And Brian Cox is doing something similar on television these days. This is a comment he made before he died of cancer in the early 80s. The dumbing down of America is the most evident in the slow decay of substantive content in the enormously influential media. The 30-second sound bites, now down to 10 seconds or less, lowest common denominator programming, credulous presentations on pseudoscience and superstition, but especially the celebration of ignorance. That's 1980. Today we're dealing with Donald Trump. I'll make no apologies for that statement. But there's another tendency as well, and that's this. If we look at the era of William Booth, we had a group of, that atheism was beginning to penetrate the world in a way it hadn't. On that top list, starting with the moustache on one side, is Nietzsche, Freud, Marx. Down the bottom, Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett, Richard Dawkins, the new atheists. What goes around comes around. I want to suggest that we are living in a revolutionary period equivalent to the revolutionary period that gave birth to the Salvation Army. What lessons can we learn from that revolutionary period which may help us in this revolutionary period? The East End of London, Catherine Booth and William Booth. The first thing to observe about them is they arrived in East London as fully formed, thoughtful, thinking through evangelists. They weren't young when they started the Salvation Army, they were in middle age. They'd been very successful evangelists. Now here's number one issue when we talk about the Salvation Army as an evangelical organisation. William and Catherine Booth were already successful evangelists in the Methodist Church, the Methodist New Connection. They were called the New Connection because they wanted to go back to Methodism as envisaged by the founder of Methodism, John Wesley. John Wesley was a high church Anglo-Catholic. He believed in the church universal as a connected agency. So the word connection was very important for William Booth as a new connection minister. They didn't believe the church was just a selection of local congregations, that it had order that was hierarchical and global. And that link in Wesley goes back to his high church Anglican origins, which goes back to the Catholic origins of the Anglican Church. The Anglican Church didn't start as a reformed version of Catholicism, it started because the king wanted a divorce. And it wasn't a theological break, it was purely pragmatic. So here we have William and Catherine Booth fully formed, theologically as evangelical Methodists, but believing that they had in some ways a responsibility for the world. This too came out of John Wesley. The other thing that's relevant, I think, is the social conditions weren't just about poverty and industry. Something else was happening as a response to the dark satanic mills of England. You had the beginning of mass organisation of people. Your favourite football team originated in the industrial heartlands of England. Sporting teams began. The great football codes, or baseball in America, emerges out of the Industrial Revolution, where groups of men or groups of women are gathered together independently of the responsibility to look after the farm and plough. They finish, they work for so many hours, they rest for so many hours, they play for so many hours. That was the theory anyway. And people could organise their lives as groups. An era of great communitarian innovation. Trade unions sprang out of the same, or we can order at work, we can get men together to make our lives better by working together. Mass movements. The first issue of the first edition of the War Cry has a statement by William Booth that famously says, "We are a Salvation Army," if you recall. The second thing is a statement quoting the Archbishop of Canterbury, Anglican, saying the only way to save the people of England is for people to work with their neighbours, to mass mobilise as people. William Booth was conscious about this when he changes from being a Christian mission to the Salvation Army. People tend to think, oh, it was all an accident. You know, things just happen. We're talking here about a conscious response to a situation where local churches were failing. Look at the external situation. The other thing that drove William Booth was his instinctive sympathy with the poor. And that is evident if you read the biographies of William Booth, particularly St. John Irvin's great biography. You find that William Booth talks about, as a young man, responding to the industrial and political unrest around him. It was the time that British people were fighting just to get the vote. The great movement of the era was Chartism. The great points of the Charter, and that had voting for male voting, unfortunately, at that stage. It's one of the foundational issues. William Booth says as a young man, his heart went out to the Chartists. He was sympathetic to the Chartists. He went along on one occasion in Nottingham to a great Chartist rally. Catherine Booth had a similar sort of sympathetic and almost radical streak in her nature too. She grew up under the profound influence of biblical teachers who emphasised St Paul's comments about in Christ is neither Jew nor Greek nor male nor female. Catherine Booth became one of the early advocates for the full equality of women preaching. That had come from some of the radical evangelists in the United States, but it was still there profoundly in her shaping this radical equality of people that again was sympathetic with the times, that people were saying justice for all. I want to share now with you some of the personalities that influenced a couple of key events. W.T. Stead, a young journalist, a Congregationalist from Darlington, up north, Sunderland, up that way. Stead was an aggressive Christian. How's this for a line? In the world's great field of battle, no duty is higher than to keep the ranks of the forces of light well filled with recruits. It is no holiday that our offspring are called, rather is it a combat long and stern, ending in inevitable death. Well, thanks, William. Yes, I'd like to sign up with that one. Very optimistic view of the world. W.T. Stead took his religion seriously. He also took his politics seriously. W.T. Stead became one of the great journalists of the Victorian age. He invented the modern newspaper. People talk about William Randolph Hearst in the United States and the yellow journalism. It was W.T. Stead who first put headlines and photographs on the front of newspapers when he was editor of the Pall Mall Gazette. It was Hearst who learnt off W.T. Stead. Such is the fame of W.T. Stead historically in journalism that there is a monument to him just near the Houses of Parliament in London, put up by the journalists of the United Kingdom on the banks of the Thames. And if you go to Central Park in New York, there's one put up by the journalists of the United States. Yet it's a man we never hear of. W.T. Stead is central in shaping the early debates about the nature of the Salvation Army. He became a very close friend of William and Catherine Booth. It started with a letter. Two young Salvation Army lasses were posted up to the coal mining district in near Darlington, where Stead was a journalist. And he was shocked that somebody like William Booth would send a 17 and a 19-year-old girl up to evangelise these rough miners. Didn't he know he was exposing them to mortal danger? William Booth replied in a letter, well, any general has to send his troops into battle. You'd be no good, you wouldn't be prepared to lose any of yours. And from that moment, a conversation started between these two men which lasted the rest of their life. Stead never became a Salvationist, but he became intimately involved with the Booth family, particularly with Catherine and Booth's eldest son, Bramwell, in shaping what the Salvation Army became. Catherine Booth was also influenced by this woman, Josephine Butler, an early Anglican feminist. Josephine Butler, high church Anglican, but again committed to women's equality. And Butler was one of those who mixed in very well-connected circles in the UK. And she became one of those who facilitated Catherine Booth being able to speak to the big end of town while William Booth was preaching in the East End. But there was another link. It was Josephine Butler who got Catherine linked up with the first time with the issue of women's rights, particularly through the trafficking of women and prostitution. The law in England in those days made the woman, the prostitute, the guilty party, and the man, the client, an innocent party. Josephine Butler believed that law was wrong and the onus should be the other way. The purchaser, the one who has the money, is the one who controls that exchange. They should be the guilty party. And Catherine was involved with a thing called the Midnight Movement that Josephine Butler was one of the prime movers of. By 1885, their relationship had become reasonably strong. In 1884-85, W.T. Stead, who also knew Josephine Butler, was so concerned about what was happening in London, because by then he was a newspaper editor in London. He'd risen up the ranks, and he put together a campaign that really put the movement we know today as the Salvation Army on the map. Some of you will know what that campaign was. It was called, that's Josephine Butler, about the time we're talking about now, the time of the, what became, anybody can tell me, the Maiden Tribute campaign. Protection of young girls. Mrs. Booth, Mrs. Josephine Butler, Professor Stewart MP, Sir Percy Bunting, Sir Baldwin Leighton, and Samuel Morley, Esquire. Now, if you know anything about British history at the time, Samuel Morley, Josephine Butler, these were names that you took seriously. You talk about members of Parliament, talking about the elite. Here is the campaign to end child prostitution in Britain. 1884, the Maiden Tribute campaign. Josephine Butler linked up with Catherine Booth. Now here's the interesting one. The Catholic Cardinal Manning and Bramble Booth to pull off this campaign. Most of you may know vaguely the story. The story goes like this, that Stead convinced Bramble Booth to set up what today we would call a sting operation, the sort of stuff that a current affair specialises in. They got a reformed prostitute to set up a shop front where she invited parents or people to bring in young girls who could be sold into prostitution. And Stead set up himself where he could record the whole transaction, where a woman brought a young girl in and the transaction took place. The young girl was taken into another room where a Salvation Army matron met her, took her down the back stairs and took her out of the country across the channel to a Salvation Army home in France where she was safe. Stead wrote up the whole exercise. Bramble Booth was set when Stead published this in the Pall Mall Gazette, and thousands rushed out to buy it. They sold out edition after edition, and even the young George Bernard Shaw was so taken up with this, he raced down to the Gazette offices to grab a whole bunch of them and take them out and sell them, help Stead sell them. This is a sidebar, when George Bernard Shaw realised the whole thing had been a setup many years later, he never forgave Stead, never spoke to him again for the rest of his life. So Stead's reputation sank under George Bernard Shaw's withering pen, because George Bernard Shaw figured it had been had. Nevertheless, the issue did demonstrate the truth of what Stead and Bramble Booth were arguing. To compound it, Bramble Booth organised a petition to Parliament, and that petition was wonderfully written out, thousands of signatures, I think like hundreds of thousands of signatures, and they had it on this huge scroll and put it on a horse and cart and took it down out in front of Parliament and unrolled it down Westminster. This was terrific publicity stuff. Catherine Booth, Bramble Booth, Josephine Butler, with the support, interestingly enough, of the Roman Catholic Cardinal Manning on child prostitution. When Stead was revealed as having pulled a stunt, the establishment was enraged because legislation had gone through the Parliament before Stead's stunt was fully revealed. The age of consent had been raised, but the establishment was enraged. Stead was charged. The woman who'd set it all up, the ex-prostitute that the Salvation Army had used, Rebecca Jarrett, was charged, and so was Bramble Booth, who'd been one of the organisers. Booth got off because he wasn't in the room when it happened. Stead and Jarrett were sent down for 6 months. Such was the outrage then, a whole other set of outrage. Even Cecil Rhodes came over when he was in England to visit Stead in prison. Cardinal Manning refused to back away, as others did. Cardinal Manning stood solidly with Stead and supported them right through, as did Catherine Booth, as did Brown and the others. The interesting thing about this is William Booth is not in the scene. William Booth is not there. This is 1884, 1885, and William Booth is uncomfortable. And here is one of the issues that begin this tension over evangelism and social justice. The Salvation Army at this time had been very good at social service. It had set up soup kitchens and all that sort of things, and they'd done lots of stuff in England. But this is the first time they'd gone out in public and gone for the big hit. William Booth was uncomfortable. William Booth was an evangelist, and he'd grown up in the Methodist tradition, and his view was that evangelism is about saving souls. And we transform the world, which he believed in social justice, but we transform the world by transforming each individual person. You get converted, you go and convert your mates and your family, and they do good by their neighbours. And gradually, one at a time, we change the world. The step that Catherine and Brownell and Stead and Josephine Butler had taken Booth to was an entirely new step. That is, that the Salvation Army as an agency, as a movement, could take a step on behalf of its members to change the way the country was governed, to change the laws. That is a whole different ballgame. William Booth genuinely wrestled with it. And if you read St. John Irvin or you read the Harold Begbie's book, you get some indication of the way that, like all of these biographies, you've got to read between the lines of it. But if you read about the period between 1884 and 1888, it's clear that Booth is really having to think hard about the Salvation Army's evangelical enterprise and what's happening on the social reform front. One thing that was clear is that the numbers of the Salvation Army up until the early 1880s were in decline. When the Salvation Army hit the national headlines by saying, "We're doing something about changing your world," numbers began to go up. People began to see an organisation that meant what it said. That was, what's the cliche about the Salvation Army? Christianity with its sleeves rolled up. It was getting dirty, it was getting into the muck, and it was doing something about it. And I've spoken in the last 12 months to both Harold Hill, who's written a recent thesis on the Salvation Army, a New Zealand officer, on ecclesiology in the Salvation Army and the way the army changed, and also to Roger Green, Salvation Army historian in the United States. Both of them said to me quite independently, and I hadn't mentioned this to them, that social justice was at the heart of the army intuitively. What Booth, what Booth was struggling with was how you brought the organisation and the individual together. This proved and has continued to be the defining problem for the Salvation Army. Let me tell you, before we get on to how that's resolved, about the outcomes of this. I've mentioned Stead. Here he is as a prisoner when he was locked up. Here's how he handled it for the rest of his life. He'd take a photo on every year on the anniversary and send it out. So there he is, sort of 25 years later, in memory of November 1885. That's when he finally went to jail. Now, here's an interesting moment, and this hasn't been written about yet, and I'll get the energy together to do something over this. That's William Booth, of course, on one side. The other person there is Cardinal Manning, who I mentioned earlier. After the Maiden Tribute campaign, Stead became close to Cardinal Manning. He introduced Bramwell to Cardinal Manning. Cardinal Manning was a very interesting man. He was also friends with Josephine Butler, because he and Josephine Butler came from the same social class. They were upper class. Cardinal Manning had been an upper class high church Anglican who converted to Catholicism. Josephine Butler was an upper class high church Anglican who stayed a high church Anglican. And it was the High Church Anglicans who were the social justice Anglicans. They were what's called the Oxford movement. And they really were the ones who thought about God in the world and active agency in the world. Manning was somebody who was a bit like a William Booth in the Catholic Church. He actually engaged in social reform activities. He encouraged the Catholic Church. So right through the 1880s, you have a very interesting discussion going on between Stead, Booth, Bramble, Butler and Cardinal Manning. And you get Bramble in Echoes and Memories talking about visiting Cardinal Manning. And you get Stead, observations about Stead, that he regarded Manning as somehow a sort of substitute father for him. He was a generation older. And Stead really looked up to Manning and sought his advice on many occasions, whilst remaining a staunch Congregationalist. Now this is a bit funny, isn't it? This is the 1880s. This is when Catholics and Protestants didn't talk to each other. Well, here you go. Here is something that on a personal level, on a liturgical level, years apart, eons apart. At a personal level, identifying with similar causes and sharing their insights together. Through the 1880s, Booth wrestled with this, as I'm sure did Manning and others. And in 1888, Booth published in the War Cry a statement that said, "Salvation for both worlds." And it was clear that he was beginning to say, hang on, the gospel requires us to be responsible in this world. And we need to use all our resources. It's not just me as a single person, it's the movement. We as a movement have to be doing something about it. And that paper, that publication of the War Cry, begins the public change for Booth. He's come to terms with, yes, I'm an evangelist, but evangelism means more than just saving the individual soul. I mentioned that part of this goes back to John Wesley, and John Wesley's sense that coming out of Catholicism into Anglicanism, into Methodism, there was this sense of the Church universal and God loving the world. This wasn't a Calvinist view that we're all predestined to hell unless we're the elect. This was a redemptive view, the whole world redeeming. Wesley was one of those who was influential in changing the 19th century. He was an inspirer not only of the whole of Methodism, of course, but of some very practical social movements. Wesley, on his deathbed, wrote this note: "Go in the name of God and the power of his might, till even American slavery, the vilest that ever saw the sun, shall vanish away." And who is he writing to? William Wilberforce, the man who ended the slave trade. That's the heritage that Booth takes. This wrestling through the 1880s eventually gives rise to Stead and Booth cooperating to produce in 1890 Booth's big manifesto on social society in darkest England and the way out. And there's a lot of argument about this. How come all of this flows out of Booth's pen over a couple of years? A fully formed scheme for redeeming the world. A practical scheme that's still quoted in sociology and social science texts today as one of the first attempts to come to terms globally with what was happening. In this book, Booth says, look, you can't blame the unemployed guy in Manchester if he's out of work from the cotton mill, because the cotton harvest failed in Georgia in the United States and the mill hasn't got any work for him. Don't blame the victim. And the causes are not local, they're global. Here is a global approach to the world in 1890. Who wrote the book? There's no doubt that William Booth used Stead to do a lot of the journalistic hack work. But physically, what was happening at this stage was Catherine was very ill. William's wife, Catherine, had breast cancer. She was dying. It was the last few months of her life. So they set up a study outside her bedroom. And William and Stead would welcome the drafts of Darkest England and they'd take them into Catherine for her to proof text them. So for people to say that this is, it's just the aberrant work of a journalist called W.T. Stead, who happened to have the attention of William Booth at a particularly hard time in his life, check your history, folks. Check the facts. There is no doubt that from 1888 on, but from 1884-85 on. William Booth had been struggling with this in 1888. He writes about it in 1890. It's fully formed. Yes, Stead does a lot of the hack work, but William and Catherine are both profoundly involved in what is darkest England and the way out. A scheme for global redemption, and what's the starting point? Work. Because if you haven't got a job, you can't feed your family, you're likely to fall into poverty yourself. Poverty is next to crime, and crime is next to dissolution. Pretty straightforward. What's our responsibility? To help create work and to help people find jobs. And that's what the darkest England scheme is really all about. Cardinal Manning was a very interesting man. Just 6 months after the publication of In Darkest England and the Way Out, the Catholic Church produced, out of Rome, under the Leo XIII, the Pope, Leo XIII, its standard work on social reform and social teaching. It's still the prime text of Catholic social thought today. It is called Rerum Novarum. Who was one of the prime advisors called to Rome to work on Rerum Novarum for the last 6 months? Cardinal Manning. Do we see Cardinal Manning's fingerprints on In Darkest England and the Way Out, and then revealed to the world in Rerum Novarum, still the standard work of Catholic social teaching today? It's somebody needs to write a PhD thesis on Manning Booth from the 1880s. What's interesting is that Manning and Booth start cooperating on social reform over sex trafficking. What we're seeing today, this year, in this place, is the Salvation Army cooperating with the Catholic Church and other agencies. What on? Sex trafficking. Bing, bing. Social change, dislocation, people on the ground get their head together, things start to change. The great Pope Leo XIII, another interesting thing about Leo XIII, this is my sidebar interest, he was the first Pope ever to be filmed, and there's a film of him getting out of a carriage in Rome, so you can actually see the man in question. Here's another man often blamed for In Darkest England the Way Out. This man was a Salvation Army officer at the time. This is, I think, probably just after he resigned. He left officership and came back a couple of times. His name is Commissioner Frank Smith, and he was appointed the first head of what William Booth set up to be not the Social Services Department, but the Social Reform Wing in 1889, 1890. Whoops, skipped on too fast. The Social Reform Wing. Here I have a copy of, I don't expect you to be able to read it, but it's the War Cry from August 1890, and you can see a page headline there, the Social Reform Wing. And each edition of the War Cry has a full page on the Social Reform Wing. And the interesting thing about the Social Reform Wing and these pages that I have is under the heading Sociology, Frank Smith gives a 5-lesson treatise breaking down the Lord's Prayer in terms of social justice. What does the Lord's Prayer mean? And he gives you 2 columns there, 2 columns in the next one. And he actually uses words like justice and other things. We're talking about 1890. Frank Smith had been a remarkable salvationist. He'd risen from naught to commissioner in 10 years. He started off, those were the days. Recognise talent, see where it gets you. He got converted in England. He was an officer for 3 or 4 years, got rapid promotion. He became a divisional commander. William Booth, there was a big kerfuffle in the Salvation Army in America. It looked like it was going to go off the rails. So William Booth said, Frank Smith, you're aggressive enough, you go over and sort the Yanks out, and he did. He had a huge success in the United States, and then he comes back to England in 1890 as the first head, as Commissioner of the Global Social Reform Wing. And Frank Smith was already fully formed in his ideas about social justice. I mean, this stuff's pouring off the pages. This wasn't somebody saying, oh, no, I do this job. He already knew what he was about. He was fully informed on social justice and what it was for. So you've got to say, hang on, so this isn't just some idea that William Booth had, because he brought Frank Smith in, and Frank Smith from the get-go, is off and running. Frank Smith, I'll tell you a little later if we've got time. Please tell me when I'm running over time. Frank Smith became one of the great heroes of the Salvation Army in its early days, but he also became a great hero in Britain generally, and I'll tell you why a little later. Let me hurry on, because you won't know this part of, some of you know this part of the story. This is Alice Barker. James and her daughter Eva, and the husband James. These were the first Salvation Army commanders in Australia, appointed in 1880. Commanded the Salvation Army in all the colonies of the Southern Seas. That's true. There was no Salvation Army in all the Southern Seas. It was just James and Alice. He was supposed to land in Adelaide, but a shipping strike forced them on to Melbourne. Somebody from the YMCA met them at the docks. James and Alice Barker. Whatever this social justice thing was, they too had it in the DNA when they arrived in 1880. So this is 10 years before the Darkest England School. Barker works his backside off for 12 months. Alice is going out into the brothels, and they put notices in the paper if any parents are concerned for their lost children or wayward children, pay us a visit, and people would come knocking on the door, and Alice would go out down the brothels and lanes of Little Bourke Street in Melbourne into the brothels. James would visit the brothels for the same purposes as his wife. The remarkable thing about it is their work became so successful that within 12 months they booked the Melbourne exhibition. You know how big that is, and they had a rally of nearly 10,000 people in the Melbourne exhibition. They got a band together for the day, but the band took one look at the side of the crowd and evacuated the stage. They got a stage fright. They wouldn't go on. But what is remarkable about the Barkers is the week before that big Melbourne exhibition rally, he's standing outside the Melbourne jail as prisoners come out and he's saying, "You got somewhere to sleep for tonight?" And he starts what's called the Prison Gate Brigade.
Hallelujah.
And John Cootes, in his book on the origins of the Salvation Army, says that point in Melbourne in 1881 is the moment when the Salvation Army formally got into social work. So we're now 10 years before Darkest England. This is organised institutional social work. We buy a building, we use it for principal purposes, and we have a social reform program built in to that building 10 years before Darkest England. In the months before Darkest England was written, or came out, in 1889, Booth recalls James Barker to London. If you want to get an idea of what the Salvation Army was like in Australia in 1899, read in Darkest England. It's full of Barker's examples. As a matter of fact, there is a letter in Darkest England, published as an appendix in Darkest England, from the Chief Secretary of the Colony of Victoria. His name? Alfred Deakin, the man who was to become Australia's second Prime Minister. Barker had made such an impression on Deakin that Deakin wanted to recommend Barker to Booth. The other thing about it is when Barker was scheduled to leave, there were protests around the colony of Victoria, and the protesters said, "William Booth, don't take this good man away." Barker duly submitted, and he had this wonderful line when he's leaving Melbourne, his last sermon. He said, "By all means aim to reach heaven, but be like Jesus, take a thief with you." Incidentally, the little girl, Eva, went on to marry, when she grew up, somebody named Osborne, who became general in the Salvation Army in the 1949-50, and was general to 1954, known as the Poet General of the Salvation Army. Alice Barker, I won't. Too many other things to talk about. Here's another Australian at the time. This guy's William Peart. William Peart's converted in the first days that Barker is in Australia. He too rose rapidly through the ranks, only in Australia. And in Australia we're very flexible about the way we organised ourselves. We changed the nature of the Salvation Army several times, just like they're doing at the moment. We had a national command, we had different names for divisions, we had different... Look, it changed quickly and dynamically. It wasn't rusted on, we were flexible. And Piatt rose up through the ranks rather rapidly under this man, Thomas Coombs, who took over after Barker. Thomas Coombs too became a very successful Salvation Army officer. As a matter of fact, he'd been one of the first who met with William Booth as a member of the Christian Mission. And the first Christian Mission conference, you can see a young Thomas Coombs sitting at the bottom of the photo. So he'd been with Booth from the beginning. He had a remarkable career in Australia in the 1890s. He goes on to become international leader in Canada as well, as Commissioner Thomas Coombs. By 1893, Piatt is working as the colony commander in Queensland under Thomas Coombs. And in 1893, the Great Queensland floods took place, which were only mirrored just a few years ago. The floods were enormous. Here is just a side of one of the hotels in Brisbane. Look at that, the water is sort of coming right up. Piatt was there as the colony commander. There's the floods he's having to come to terms with at the time. What does Piatt do in response to the horrors of floods like this? He gets the Salvation Army organised. And he goes to one of the places that's been mostly flooded out completely. There's just a couple of other shots around the place. It's Milton, it's under the water. This is the New Farm Racecourse. When the water sank, Piatt goes down to the New Farm Racecourse and he gets the Salvation Army organised, and he gets people from a couple of the social institutions, like the prison gate homes and a couple of other places, and he goes to the big shops and he goes to their Manchester departments and he says, look, you've got Manchester that's soaked out, that's ruined by mud and water, give it to us. We'll make sure it's cleaned and dried and we'll make it available to all of those people who have lost everything in the floods. So the big companies around Brisbane contribute all this. The water goes down at New Farm Racecourse. They peg out all of Manchester at New Farm Racecourse and dry it out in the sun, clean it and wash it over a few days. And over a Sunday they're working. And a clergyman was said to pass Piatt in the street and was very critical of the Salvation Army working on the Lord's Day, on the Sabbath. And Piatt was tempted to compare it to Balaam's ass or something like that. So you've got this instinctive social justice sense, even in the earliest manifestation of the Salvation Army. Booth was no accident, is what I'm saying, about early Salvationists and their response. Thomas Coombs, same year, 1893, Christmas. I'm getting to the end of the story, folks. Christmas, 1893, this is the war cry. Goodwill, being the Christmas number of the war cry, the official gazette of the Salvation Army in Australia and Tasmania. Ooh, that's interesting. The Salvation Army Santa Claus presents with Australia the golden keys to prosperity. Let's have a look at what the Salvation Army Santa Claus is doing. Now, you're not going to be able to read this, so I'll read a little bit of it to you. William Booth looks remarkably like Santa Claus. Well, it's Santa Claus pre-Coca-Cola and the furry stuff. St. Nicholas. He's wearing a laurel, or he's wearing a wreath of holly, and he's pointing out like God in Michelangelo's painting, The Great Creation. And he's carrying the key to prosperity, which is a cross. You see in the key? Cross. Okay. Look where he's put the Salvation Army Temple. The Salvation Army Temple right down in the High Street. All the crowd streaming down the street to the Salvation Army Temple. You can see that. Down the street, Salvation Army. Now, let me read to you what the three big statues say, because this is the key to the message. He's put the Salvation Army next door to a school, which is next door to a museum, which is across the road from the Technical College. That is, he's placing the Salvation Army in the centre of the city, in the centre of the city's business. That is, the intellectual and cultural life of the city. And look what the statues say. For one, Moses holding the tablets of the law, the Ten Commandments, knowledge, intelligent acquaintance with divine truth. Ooh, Wise government, home, local and national. That is, it's about the way we organise our civil society. Free education, intellectual and moral. Free education. Salvation Army is really getting into it here. Get this next one. Literature, science and art popularised. Salvation Army, 1893. The next statue, Truth, Lady Liberty holding the torch. Purity in press and politics. Well, did you read the paper this week? Justice, free and for all. Took us 100 years to get Salvo's legal. Thank God for that, eh? When legal aid is collapsing, Salvo's legal has come into being. Justice, free and for all, 1893, Salvation Army, Australia. Honesty in commerce and finance. Again, I refer you to the newspapers. A faithful pulpit and platform. That is, we need to preach about this stuff. We need to teach about this stuff. The final statue is love. A Salvationist holding a cross, I think modelled on Elijah Cadman, if my sort of Salvation Army photographic history is anything to go by. Love. Now, look at the expression of love. This isn't personal, Jesus is my boyfriend sort of love. This is the brotherhood of man and active force. Unity of Christian effort. Goodwill between capital and labour. Federation of colonies and nations. This is the years, 1893, when the Federation debates are getting going in Australia. Herbert Booth, who took over after Coombs, actually pushed the Federation banner and made the Salvation Army an official vehicle for Federation. We actually had Advance Australasia across the crest of the Salvation Army right through the 1890s. That's getting into politics in a big way, because New South Wales didn't want to be in the Federation. New Zealand voted out altogether. Western Australia, the vote nearly went down. It took the vote twice to get through the Federation vote. The Salvation Army, when Herbert Booth was asked, he said, well, just as St Paul says there should be no division between men and women, we figure that the more barriers between people you can pull down, the better. And if we can dissolve barriers, we're going to be better together. It was all expressed back in darkest England in 1890 in the Salvation Army's expression, work for all, the top of the banner of the darkest England scheme. But in that same year, 1893, William Booth was also the same William Booth who'd founded an evangelical mission to the world. And in 1893, as all these social justice platforms are unrolling, they have a big meeting takes place at Exeter Hall in London. The Salvation Army held a big meeting at Exeter Hall in London. Big campaign meeting. They had to have a name for the campaign. Now, I've got to tell you about Exeter Hall. Exeter Hall is the place where all those concerned with Christian mission, particularly social justice and evangelism and that sort of stuff, would get together every year for the Exeter Hall meetings. And it was the big do, you know, all them Wilberforce type Methodists and all the others would gather in Exeter Hall for the big gatherings. William Booth was struggling. 1893, the same month that Christmas war cry was published, William Booth is struggling with what to call the Exeter Hall meetings. He called the meetings the Boundless Salvation meetings. He wrote the song for the meeting. Boundless Salvation. It's become the anthem of the Salvation Army, on Boundless Salvation. Social justice and evangelism were knitted together by those difficult years from 1880 to 1893. And by 1893, social justice was powering through the Salvation Army and its evangelical mission was powering. So much so that Booth could confidently write on Boundless Salvation, devotion of love and fullness of mercy Christ brought from above, the whole world redeeming. And you know now what's meant by the world. It's a physical entity. Booth even coined a word for it. He called it temporal salvation, saving people in this world from the evils of this world. Here in the fullest. Thank you very much. A little bonus. Let me give you this little bonus. Are you ready to hear this? Because it's one of those things. Unless you, this is 1907, 1908. All right. Unless you think that William Booth didn't really mean what I had him saying, hear this.
I am glad you are enjoying yourself. The salvation is the friend of happiness. Making heaven on earth is our business. Serve the Lord with gladness is one of our favorite mottos. So I am pleased that you agree. But amidst all your joy, don't forget the thoughts of misery. Do you ever visit them? Come away, let them make call. Here is a home, peace and family. They eat and drink and sleep and speak and die in the same chamber. Here is a doctor's house, void of furniture, wife of skeleton, children in rags, father now feeding the victims of his neglect. Here are the unemployed, wandering about seeking work and finding not. Yonder are the wretched criminals, cradled in crime, back in and out of the prison, all the time. There are the daughters of shame, disease and wrong and ruin, traveling down the dark incline to an early grave. There are the children fighting in the gutters, going hungry to school, growing up to be their parents' slaves, brought it all on themselves, you say, perhaps so. But that does not excuse our success. You don't demand the certificate of virtue before you drag them down each creature out of the water, not the assurance that a man has paid his rent before you deliver it from the burning beach. But what shall we do? Content ourselves by singing a hymn, offering a prayer, or giving a little good advice? No. 10,000 times no. We will forgive them, teach them, replace them, employ them. Perhaps we should face the very quite likely, but our duty is to help them all the same, and that is the most practical, economical, and right manner. So let us take to the rescue, for the sake of our own peace, the poor themselves, leaders, children, and the Savior of all. The human help of the means, and as there is nothing like rest, who in his company will lend a hand by taking off the journey.
That was William Booth, recorded in 1908. Still fighting on.
We have some time for questions, a couple of minutes for questions. And I should have mentioned earlier, we do have a live stream, so we will use the microphone if anybody has a question, just to make sure they can hear at home. But does anybody have a question? Raise your hand if you do. Anyone on the live stream?
It's a privilege to be here the first time, and it's great to see that actually that you brought up of evangelism and also social justice. And for me, I'm coming from a finance department, and from the finance perspective, that we always think that how we can best to help in the perspective of the church and the social program. So in that perspective, to you, do you have any maybe ideas or advice in that sense?
This is an interesting question. It's a perennial one. That is, we've got to raise the money. Can we afford to go out too far on some of the maybe unpopular social justice issues that may be unpopular with our own people even, not only with the community out there? It's a perennial one. It's one that Booth had to confront, and it's one they did confront. And you have to institutionally address it. And I think one of the institutional priorities, this is just from an observation of years, is that you've got to split your fundraising arm from your policy arm. And that way, the finance people can take direction from the policy from the policy arm. quite often what happens is the fundraising arm begins to say, no, if you do that, we're not going to get any money. And that begins to distort your priorities. Public broadcasters face the same problem. I mean, I spent some years on the ABC board. One of the parameters was, who do you get into bed with? And the line in the sand was, over issues of money. You've got to keep a discrete wall between the cause you exist for and the means that fund it. And that is a perennial. There's no magic answer to it. It requires sort of integrity, really. But it is the continual binding difficulty for all social and church-based agencies, but all those with a public purpose rather than a commercial purpose.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Did William Booth ever start businesses for the express purpose of nothing else but raising money?
No. I'll give you two examples. The match factory in England and the film business in Australia. They were both set up as independent businesses. The Salvation Army Motion Picture Company ran in Australia for 10 years. At one stage it was the biggest motion picture production company in the country. But it was not for the purposes, they made a lot of money, but it was not primarily for that purpose. Similarly with the match factory. The match factory one's interesting. Barker went to England and the first job given in the Darkest England campaign was to join with the trade union movement and fix the conditions that women were suffering in the match industry, the piecework match industry. People were being killed by Fossey Jaw. They bought a match factory, Salvation Army matches. That business never made a profit, but William Booth stayed in there until the entire match industry in England had changed their manufacturing processes. He underbid the market, he raised the workers' wages to a decent wage, he changed the chemical production to a safety matches production, kept funding the business until the objective was obtained and they sold the business and walked away. So they even were prepared to keep funding a losing business to change the way business worked. And they succeeded. It takes vision. I think Employment Plus was started in the same way. What killed Employment Plus, and I think this is a private view, I think the Army should have sold Employment Plus 7 or 8 years ago. Why? Because the government kept imposing restrictions on it which narrowed the capacity of the Salvation Army to do the right thing by the unemployed. In those early years when Employment Plus took off, it worked because Salvationists and employees were able to say to the unemployed, oh look, you've got a really particular difficulty, we can fund you to get over and get a mining job in WA. Pay us back later on. You couldn't do that under the regulations as they operate now. So you've got to be very careful with business operations, because I think what happened with Employment Plus is we were making so much money in those early days that the golden egg became the prize rather than the people who were being serviced. Now, I'm not critical of anybody in that. It's a real dilemma. You've got to be aware of it all the time.
I suppose it's just around the idea of funding and government funding for our social services, and obviously a bit of that tension that plays out in the first answer that you gave. I'm wondering, did William Booth have any government funding, or and how did he negotiate that, or is that more of a modern tension that the Army deals with?
It's more of a modern tension. The Army was actively involved beyond the Darkest England scheme, right up into the 1910s. The Army was involved in fighting for changes to the Education Acts and things for children and other things. So they were continually involved in the political process, but governments didn't start funding agencies until much later on. It's after the Second World War you get real active government involvement in funding agencies. One interesting thing, when William Booth died, a small booklet was published in tribute to him by the British Labour Exchange. It was written by a young guy called William Beveridge, who, for those who know the history, went on to become the founder of the welfare state 30 years later.
I think we would all agree that the Salvation Army's work is one of proclamation and demonstration. Proclamation of the kingdom of God, reigning and demonstrating how that kingdom reign looks like. I think, from my experience, I've been engaged with a number of conversations which tries to weigh one up as more important than the other, especially in our modern context. From your perspective, how would you engage in that conversation?
Quote William Booth. It was a fabulous quote that retired Commissioner in the United States, Phil Needham, has in his book, Community and Mission, where he quotes William Booth when a journalist approached him on the issue of evangelism and social workers and their intention. He said, "They're Siamese twins. To kill one is to slay them both." Great line, and a good line to start from. Let me just give you one anecdote to finish with. I mentioned Frank Smith, and I said he became famous. Frank Smith left the Salvation Army in 1890 because he and William Booth had a disagreement about the structural funding stuff. There was no animosity between them. He later came back as an officer. But one of the things he was committed to the whole social justice thing, and he didn't let it go. He went on to become an activist in what was then called the Independent Labour Party in Britain. And if you want to know how much of the Salvation Army emerged in what became the British trade union movement, let me show you that. A trade union newspaper, The Workers' Cry, edited by Commissioner Frank Smith. And look at the crest. It's a Salvation Army crest with a few alterations. The Independent Labour Party preceded the British Labour Party. Frank Smith made a little bit of money, he had a house, and a young guy was boarding with him who was standing for Parliament. And when this man eventually got into Parliament, he was so pleased that he asked Frank Smith to drive the coach in which he became the first Labour Member of Parliament. His name was Keir Hardie. Frank Smith drove the coach that took Keir Hardie into Westminster. And for those who know their sort of Labour history, that is a singular moment in the history of one whole strand of modern history. It's just an extraordinary story that needs to be unpacked.
Well, we want to thank you, John, for tonight, don't we? We want to thank you. When you're presenting or leading something like this, and you ask if there's any questions and everybody's silent, there's often an issue in your mind about whether actually there are no questions and nobody's listening, or whether everybody's so processing so much information that they don't quite know how to verbalise that, and I'm certain that that was the case tonight, because it certainly was the case in my mind. So we want to thank you just for challenging us in that way. We do have a small thank you for you here. Now, I've just come back from the States recently, and in the States they make funny Salvation Army things. So we got you this. This is George Scott Railton. And he's a bobblehead. Yes, it's from the States. But we got George Scott Railton for a number of reasons. As you know, he served in a whole lot of different places, Canada, West Africa, South Africa, all over the world, and we know that you like to travel and like to see different parts. So we thought that fitted well. But also, he was the editor of the Christian, I'm sure you know this, the editor of the Christian Mission magazine, Journalism, right up there. So we thought he fitted well. So that's for you, and there's another small thank you in there as well. But we do just want to thank you. Please thank John. And just in closing, we were very intentionally inviting John tonight. Tonight was not meant to be a night that purely increased our knowledge of Salvation Army history. That was not the purpose, although he certainly has done that for us. The purpose tonight was to challenge us as the Salvation Army today to see where God wants us right now. We have so many things happening. As John pointed out, there were so many things happening both within the Salvation Army and external to the Salvation Army in the early times as well. The context, the thing that struck me the most was that the contexts were so similar. Numbers were declining, The world was seeming more crazy than ever, and yet the Salvation Army pushed ahead in so many ways, including social justice, and their numbers increased and grew. What's to say we cannot do that again today? So tonight, while we increased our knowledge of the Salvation Army, we intentionally asked John because he challenges us for today. He motivates us through the history to actually see a better tomorrow, challenging the past in order to see a better tomorrow. So I encourage you, as you go home and process tonight, think about what happened in the past in terms of what God wants from us today and what that means for us individually. Thanks for coming. See you at the next Salvo Academy. Have a good night.